What's Going On and On in the Middle East by Robert Allen Burton. As soon as the 9/11 attacks took place, I, like everyone else, awaited word of an explanation. The announcement came that we would find out where the terrorist had came from and make no distinction between the terrorist and the countries harboring these terrorists. The first country mentioned after this was Afghanistan. I immediately looked up Afghanistan on the internet. I assumed that this all must have something to do with oil. After all, why do we know so much about the Middle East and hear about these countries all the time? And why do we have any involvement with these countries at all? Oil, or so I thought. But I was surprised to find out that Afghanistan does not have major oil reserves. I guessed I jumped to the wrong conclusion. I decided I would research what was going on in the oil business and what countries were the key players. I discovered a website called oilsurvey.com. At the top of the home page was a quote by George Bush Sr. It read, "The most informative website on what is going on in the oil business." The Bush family is in the oil business, so I figured he would probably know. On that website, you could browse by country. I decided that I would give Afghanistan another look. To my surprise, articles came up instantly. I didn't have to scroll down very far to find out how Afghanistan plays a very important role in the Middle East oil game. It turns out that Tajikistan to the north has huge oil supplies, one of the largest untapped oil supplies in the world. If drilled, it would be the biggest oil boom since oil was tapped in Saudi Arabia. It is estimated that Tajikistan, a little larger than the U.S. state of Maryland, holds 85 billion barrels of crude oil as well as a huge amount of natural gas reserves. Tajikistan used to be part of the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union broke apart into separate entities, suddenly this oil reserve was in the market. But it is landlocked, and there is no way the U.S. could transport oil without passing through other countries. After all, oil can't be effectively flown out of the Middle East. It must be shipped in large oil tanker sea vessels. So an American oil company named Unocal decided to seek out a way to build a pipeline from Tajikistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan into the Indian Ocean where it could be shipped out. Pakistan is oil business friendly. Sure, they would demand a share of the money, but they are open for business. But Afghanistan, on the other hand, in 2001, was still a wild frontier where most of the Muslims lived the same way their ancestors did 2,000 years ago, shepherding their herds of animals. They don't use oil and they don't want any intrusion by the outside world who does. Aside from those living this traditional life are bands of outlaw gangs roaming around in trucks and tanks acquired during the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Therefore, this pipeline would be in constant jeopardy of vandalistic destruction. So before construction on this pipeline could begin, measures had to be taken to secure it. The largest and best armed gang in Afghanistan was called the Taliban. Unocal began meeting with leaders of the Taliban to make a deal in which the Taliban would serve as a police force for the pipeline. In return, they would be paid greatly and be well armed. But Unocal was not the only one who had ideas. Iran also had big plans for Tajikistan's oil reserves. Iran's plan was to overthrow the Taliban and use their own armies to police a pipeline or trucking route through Afghanistan. In the first part of 2001, the UN dispatched forces to the Afghan-Iran border to stop Iranian forces from entering Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Unocal negotiated with the Taliban and even had Taliban leaders visit the United States. But the Taliban also had ties to a faction of the Muslim faith who oppose westernization and technology. These factions believe that the only good use for modern technology is to be used against itself to destroy modern technology. These Muslim hardliners, like Osama bin Laden, also had the ear of the Taliban. Their theology offered a way that the Taliban could justify and continue their pillaging and looting and yet still see themselves as a holy instrument in the hand of Allah to combat the Western devils. In August of 2001, yes, August, that month just prior to September, Unocal made one last offer to the Taliban and said, and this is a quote I will never forget because of the adrenaline rush it produced when I read it during the week after September 11th, 2001. Either accept this red carpet offer or you will receive a carpet of bombs. I read of that negotiation with my own eyes, which was reported openly on oilsurvey.com. This was not some article that was printed as a conspiracy theory later. It was reported on oilsurvey.com as part of its Around the World oil news ticker in August, just prior to the 9/11 attacks. I was astonished. I printed it off the computer because it was evidence that a private American company had made a threat of military attack overseas. This was not the United States military speaking to the Taliban. It was a private American company. Do these billionaire business owners really have so much power that the military answers to them? And would the American public actually consent to their family members risking their lives overseas to secure a business deal for these billionaires? Probably not, unless they would personally prosper or there was some reason to believe that America itself was in jeopardy. On September 11th, the American people were given that reason to go to war against these dark forces in the Middle East. First stop, Afghanistan. Wow, and only a month after the threat Unocal made. Then on to Iraq. After all, we were making no distinction between the terrorists and the countries that harbored them. Yet of the 19 hijackers, 15 were Saudi Arabian, 2 were from the Union of Arab Emirates, 1 was from Lebanon, and 1 from Egypt, all of which countries America has stable relationships. None of the hijackers were Iraqi or Afghan natives. All of this I write speaking only of documented facts. I will not elaborate with conspiracy theories or draw conclusions for you given these facts. My kid's mom destroyed the documents I printed from oilsurvey.com because she was worried about the post-9/11 witch hunt. When I went back to that website a month or so later, it had been disbanded and became only a listing for jobs in the oil business. If you punch it into your computer today, you will see that that domain name is for sale, and I will spare you all my suspicions. As for Iraq, I remember as a child when Iraq and Iran were at war, and I was a huge Ronald Reagan fan and supporter. Iran were the evil Russia lovers, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq were the good guys. Iraq represented everything Muslim hardliners feared most: men without beards and women without their faces covered up. Things Osama bin Laden and his like were dead set against. During the 70s and 80s, when Saddam was committing genocide against Muslim hardliners who opposed westernization of Iraq, he was hailed as an innovative leader paving the way for a freer Middle East. But it turns out that Iraqi oil fields had been leased to British oil companies back in the early 40s during World War II, much like how Hong Kong was leased to Great Britain at one time. During subsequent years, American oil companies bought in on a cut of the oil fields. But that 50-year lease ended in the early 1990s. At that point, Iraq, led by Saddam, assumed control over its oil fields, while Kuwait, a land area of dispute as to whether or not it is its own country or part of Iraq, led by a monarch, Al-Hamad al-Sabah, struck a deal with the British and U.S. oil companies. Although the monarch himself, Al-Hamad al-Sabah, was living in Saudi Arabia because he feared for his life at the hand of the people who lived in Kuwait. Saddam declared that Kuwait was part of Iraq and sent forces there. America defended the monarchy of Kuwait and thusly the oil deal via the First Gulf War. Iraq was effectively driven out of Kuwait, but the fact of the matter remained, even without Kuwait, Iraq had enough oil reserves that they would have prospered and perhaps rose into a superpower. Like sometimes happens in professional wrestling, during my lifetime I saw Saddam Hussein go from being promoted as one of the good guys to one of the bad guys. Now Saddam and bin Laden are both dead, but we are not out of hot water in the Middle East. By we, I mean the common people who are under control of the businessmen who control the governments. Still seek that Tajikistan oil via the Afghan pipeline. And it's in the worst of worst locations. It's got China as a close neighbor to the east, Russia to the north, and Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to the south. And as long as there are billions to be made in oil, the billionaires will keep fighting for it to the very last drop. Chinese billionaires, Russian billionaires, Arab billionaires, and American billionaires fighting against one another. Well, actually, they won't be physically fighting for it. Common people under the rule will. I consider myself fortunate because I believe that most of the men and women of our armed forces will seek a way to do good things while they serve their tour of duty overseas. So they will win some respect and appreciation towards America by the virtuous behavior. But make no mistake about it, they're being put in a hell of a dangerous situation. While the billionaires who are using them as pawns in their chess games for world domination will be sipping tea or scotch in London, Sydney, Paris, or Tangier. After all, national boundaries don't apply to them, so don't expect them to display any sort of loyalty or patriotism to a nation or people. National boundaries to them exist as an indication of what sections they have control over. But these boundaries and peoples do not have control over them. They can go wherever on earth they want in their private jets. They can have breakfast in Mexico City and dinner that same evening in Moscow. I hope and pray that they can learn to display compassion and generosity towards the rest of us and work these matters out peacefully. If they can't, then I hope and pray that the rest of us can learn to come together to resist, overcome, and escape their tyranny.